Hello everyone, this is Basileus. Welcome to the fourth episode of Battlefield's use of photogrammetry and how this ties up to today's games. Been away for some time. First of all, I was traveling for business. I went for 1 week to Milan in Italy. It's a great city. If you want to visit once in your lifetime, it's probably worth it. Not more than that, in my view. It's a bit too expensive for my taste, given what it's giving. Unless you're, I don't know, a luxury shopper and you enjoy this kind of stuff, then it's probably worth it to visit a little bit more often. But the major issue for me was that once I returned from Milan, I immediately fell ill. I was down for more than 2 weeks actually. I thought I had COVID. I was feeling horribly, really. But I did a multi-test and turned out it was influenza B. It's the first time in my life that I get this disease, first time in my life that I get the flu. I had no idea that it was such a horrible feeling, honestly. It hit me like a truck, like vomiting and extreme tiredness and shivering. Oh my god, the shivers. Muscle pain, eyes burning, you name it. I mean, what could have happened to me, it did happen. It took me more than 2 weeks to feel better. Even now, I'm not 100% back. But yeah, I had no idea that influenza was so bad, the B variant specifically that I was suffering from. And yeah, take care of yourselves because you never know what's going to happen next day, basically. So that's a little intro about what's been happening to me and why there hasn't been any updates lately, any new episodes on our series, but I didn't forget about you and I'm back and let's get to it. So in the previous episode, we looked at why Battlefield 1 still looks so good today, even compared to many games that came out years later. A big part of that came down three things working together: photogrammetry, carefully controlled detail, and lighting that was mostly baked ahead of time, which gave the game a level of stability that modern real-time systems often struggle to maintain. But the story doesn't end there, because Battlefield 1 wasn't just a successful game. It was also the last Battlefield built around that philosophy. And that is because the moment you move forward to Battlefield 5, you start seeing a shift. Not just in how the game looks, but in what the engine is trying to achieve. And that shift tells us a lot about where the entire industry was heading. When Battlefield 5 was announced, you see, most players expected something fairly straightforward. They assumed it would basically be Battlefield 1, but with newer technology, meaning more detail, better lighting, maybe larger environments, and the usual incremental improvements you expect between entries in the same series. But under the hood, the priorities were already changing. Instead of simply refining the visual approach used in Battlefield 1, DICE started leaning much more heavily into dynamic systems, meaning systems where the world is constantly reacting to gameplay instead of remaining visually stable.
Don't let them take the objective.
On paper, this sounds like a clear improvement. A battlefield where buildings collapse dynamically, lighting reacts to explosions, weather rolls in naturally, and environments evolve during a match is incredibly appealing.
We have taken objective Freddy.
But once you start pushing games in that direction, the entire rendering pipeline has to change. One of the first places players noticed that change was something surprisingly simple: enemy visibility. At launch, Battlefield 5 received a lot of criticism from players who felt that enemies were unusually difficult to spot, especially in cluttered environments or darker areas of the map. This wasn't because the game lacked visual quality. If anything, the opposite was true. Battlefield 5 increased the density of environmental detail compared to Battlefield 1, layering foliage, debris, surface variation, and material complexity across the environment in ways that looked impressive from a purely technical perspective. But gameplay readability started to suffer. And that is because when every surface is rich with texture, rich with shadow variation and material complexity, characters can blend into the environment in ways that simply didn't happen as often in Battlefield 1, where visual composition tended to guide your attention more deliberately. This is one of the subtle trade-offs that appears when visual density becomes a priority. More detail doesn't always make a scene easier to understand. Sometimes it does the opposite. Lighting also began to change in Battlefield 5. While Frostbite had already supported dynamic lighting in earlier games, Battlefield 5 leaned further in that direction, increasing the number of situations where lighting needed to react dynamically to what was happening in the world. Explosions, destruction, environmental effects, and changing weather all meant that the lighting environment would no longer be as tightly controlled as it was in Battlefield 1. This might sound like a purely technical detail, but it has major consequences. When lighting is baked ahead of time, you see, artists can shape the environment extremely precisely. They know exactly where shadows fall, they know exactly how indirect light fills the space, and they know exactly how materials will appear during gameplay. But once lighting becomes more dynamic, that certainty goes out of the window. The environment becomes more reactive, but also less predictable. And this is where Battlefield's signature feature start to play a major role. We're talking about destruction. Destruction has always been a defining part of the series. But as it becomes more dynamic and systemic, it starts creating new technical demands. If a building collapses during a match, the lighting in that space cannot stay the same. If walls disappear, sunlight suddenly reaches areas that were previously in shadow. If debris changes the shape of an environment, the way light interacts with that environment also changes. At that point, baked lighting stops being sufficient. You need systems that can update lighting in real time. And once you start down that road, you're effectively committing to a much more complex rendering pipeline.
We have taken objective Charlie.
Battlefield 5 also pushed dynamic weather and atmospheric effects further. Snowstorms, rain, and changing skies were designed to make matches feel more alive and unpredictable. These systems add atmosphere and they add variety, but they also introduce another level of complexity because atmospheric conditions directly affect lighting, visibility, and color balance across the entire scene. A world where lighting conditions are constantly changing is a world where baked solutions become increasingly difficult to maintain. And so the engine begins shifting towards systems that can respond dynamically to everything happening on screen. Battlefield 5 wasn't, however, the only game moving in this direction. Around the same time, the entire industry was starting to prioritize dynamic worlds over static ones. Players wanted environments that reacted to them. Developers wanted tools that allowed artists to build massive environments without baking lighting for every possible scenario. And hardware was becoming powerful enough that real-time global illumination systems began to feel within reach.
Protect the objective.
This is the same trend that eventually leads to technologies like Unreal Engine 5's Lumen, where lighting is designed to react dynamically to everything happening in the world. But that flexibility comes with a price. Once lighting, destruction, weather, and environmental interaction all become dynamic systems, rendering stops being a static problem and becomes a constantly evolving one. That means that every frame requires new calculations. Every change in the world can affect how light behaves. And that means the engine has to find ways to maintain visual stability even while everything underneath it is constantly changing. And that's where modern reconstruction techniques, temporal filtering, and upscaling systems start to become essential parts of the rendering pipeline. Battlefield 5 represents a turning point. That is undoubtable. Battlefield 1 was built around certainty, carefully captured assets, stable lighting, and tightly directed scenes. Battlefield 5, on the other hand, begins the transition toward reactive worlds, where systems respond dynamically to gameplay.
We have taken objective Duff.
Neither approach is inherently better, but once you understand that shift, you start to see why modern games behave so differently from older ones. And in the next episode, we're going to zoom in on the core of that transformation: dynamic lighting itself, and why simulating light in real time changes everything about how games are built. My name is Basileus. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps immensely. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.